conosco nesta conferencia. Para todos los participantes de habla hispana, bienvenidos al Congreso y les agradecemos su presencia y colaboración. I am Patrick Kapili of the Ateneo Modern Languages Department, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Today's program is the last panel for the second part of our conference, which focuses on the legacies of the encounter on ideas and identity formation. Panel 9 will discuss the emergence of the Filipino-Hispanic identity. This afternoon, we are privileged to have three distinguished speakers. After their presentations, we will have some time to interact with them and ask them our questions. For our conference participants on Zoom, you may raise your hands virtually and wait to be called, or you may type your questions on the chat box. For those who are joining us via live stream on YouTube and Facebook, you may use the live chat option or comment section for your questions. Our community managers will monitor these channels and relay your questions to our speakers. I invite all our participants and viewers to join in the discussion for a fruitful exchange of ideas and lively interaction with our distinguished panel. Thank you very much. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Ruth de Llobet. Dr. Llobet is currently an assistant faculty fellow of history at the New York University, Shanghai in China. Today, she will talk to us about Demostración del miserable estado de las Islas Filipinas, an example of Spanish knowledge production for colonial governance. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ruth de Llobet.
Hi, good afternoon. Let me share. So before I begin, do you see the screen? Do you see the PowerPoint? Excellent.
Yes, we do.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much, Ateneo de Manila and the CHAM for organizing this conference, but also especially to Chas Navarro for inviting me, for reaching me here in Shanghai. This presentation, basically, or this small presentation, is part of an ongoing project of doing a critical edition in English of the document Demostración del miserable estado de las Islas Filipinas. So if there is any points or ideas, they would be welcome because this is still in a work in progress. So let me begin. The conference basically will be an overview of knowledge production literature in the Spanish Empire. Then I will talk about who is Francisco Leandro de Viana and historical importance, and how does these ideas of knowledge production play out in VIANA'S corpus of documents, and then I will conclude. So once said that, let's begin. So the latest debates regarding knowledge production and imperial governance in the Spanish Empire, articulated in recent works, such as those of Arne Brandecke, Daniela Bleimark, and Jorge Cañizares Guerra, argues that in the Spanish Empire, a variety of actors and institutions produce and gather information, generating knowledge, which, however, was not necessarily put to the use by the Spanish crown. More often than not, such information contained in surveys, maps, botanical studies, etc., was archived and dismissed without ever having been used as a reference for governmental decisions, especially in the 18th century. According to Arne Brandecke, in the 16th and 17th century Spanish Empire, information was not equated with power for controlling a territory. Knowledge was not produced within a framework of political rationalization from the center, nor was it strongly connected to empirical research. He argues that information was sent by various actors across the diverse spaces and positions to create a consensus between the king and his subjects around the latter's loyalty. To act fairly, the king had to know how to reward or punish, and even remote subjects felt encouraged to inform him of their actions or of the wrongdoings of others. More commonly, such information was gathered by mediators, articulated within imperial networks. usually colonial officials who thus share some of the king's powers as they maintain the king informed of his subjects' loyalty. However, not mandatorily, like a private person could also write to the king if they want. It is within this context that a political genre was born in the 17th century, el arbitrio o arbitrismo. Documents, or basically textual practice, that propose grand or simplistic solution to fiscal and economic problems without citing or using relevant sources or data and without having been requested in the first place. Such texts were generally written by individuals who sought to adulate the monarch while advancing their personal interest. As well as shape and motivate by personal and group interest, empirical knowledge and or data was used selectively, and thus the king was also persistently mis or ill-informed. The knowledge gathered by the center was framed by an unspoken consensus between the king and his subjects, who operated in a complex scheme of socioeconomic networks around the empire. At the colonial level, this consensus meant that the king's decisions were always legitimized, for he was supposed to have access to all the sides of an issue. But there were cases in which the monarch was deceived, or at least this was the logical behind some subjects' refusal to comply with royal rulings, the famous obedezco pero no cumplo, I obey but not comply, that gave flexibility to colonial praxis without challenging royal authority. For the 18th century, Blakemer's Visible Empires suggest that in the 18th century, the consensus-seeking knowledge still operated. However, the new Bourbon dynasty, which created a stronger bureaucratic structure to reconquer the empire, set in place new politics of knowledge production, along with its new centralized policies. Knowledge was produced for governance purposes, for policies imposed from the center, based on the rational application of information gathered around the empire, began gaining ground, as Matthew Crawford points out in his dissertation about the monopoly of quina. There was, moreover, a greater power and greater presence of Spanish officials, which was meant to increase royal control over the colonial bureaucracy through the disempowerment of local power groups, an aim that was not wholly achieved. These create tensions within the empire, whose consequences this paper will not explore. Suffice to say, however, that the consensus between the king and his subjects was reformulated, for the monarch was no longer merely the wise and superseding arbiter, as he had been in the past, but also an interested party, an actor whose interest was supposed to be upheld by his representatives in the struggle of interest that prevailed in colonial as in all societies. His interest was one among many, because the Spanish crown never had enough financial, economic, or military power to fully and categorically execute its policies. Although knowledge in the Spanish Empire was still produced by diverse actors, the crown privileged the information gathered by Spanish bureaucrats sent to the colonies, instead of that generated and produced by local agents like criollos, mestizos, or indigenous officials. And bureaucratic royalist narratives became hegemonic over other types without entirely supplanting them. It is in this context that another genre emerged, proyectismo. Proyectismo was a political and administrative textual practice that proposed long-term and structural remedies for specific social, administrative, economic, and political problems within the empire. Authors used a wide variety of documentation and statistical information that connected the issue with wider and more general frameworks, without losing sight of the possibilities of career advancement that a well-received report could entail. But this does not alter the fact that such texts were written with the honest purpose of generating reforms. In this sense, they can be regarded as a Spanish investigative modality, surveys and enumerations as defined by Bernard Cohn in his book on the British in India. But the nature of proyectista text did not have the same impact in the Spanish Empire as British investigative modalities did in the British Empire, because power and governance in the Spanish world were institutionalized very different from the British one. The political consensus between the Spanish monarch and his subjects was never totally broken, at least not until the arrival of the 1812 Constitution. So how do all these ideas play out in Francisco Leandro de Viana's corpus of documents, and who is Francisco Leandro de Viana? I argue that the set of proyectista documents written by Francisco Leandro de Viana, the Apuntes of 1764, La Demostración of 1765, and La Demostración de lo que contribuyen estos súbditos of 1766, are representatives of a Spanish type of knowledge production encouraged by the imperial center to understand and control the empire, but with results and a political context that were not comparable to the British. In the Spanish context, a hegemonic metropolitan vision competed with local forms of knowledge, shaping policies that were meant to regain the control of the empire from those local elites. But those local elites who were subjects, but not Spanish ethnically speaking, their forefathers had been part of the Spanish empire for centuries. So those dynamics were kind of very difficult to break. More especially, Viana's texts are the first example in the Philippines of how the imperial gaze shift from local informants to Spanish bureaucrats, as a new economic development plan was generated for the archipelago that favored royal and metropolitan interest. Unsurprisingly, although Viana's plan were later applied, they met with criticism in Spain and created tensions within the colony. So before to address the documents, let's talk first about the author. Francisco Leandro de Viana was a high bureaucrat, the Fiscal General de la Audiencia de Manila in 1759 to 1767. Viana's superiors perceived him as an honest, efficient, and meticulous man, as well as a hardworking officer. His report set the key economic guidelines for the socioeconomic reforms implemented during the 1780s and the 1790s in the Philippines. His experience in the archipelago from, as I said, 1759 to 1767, made him the main advisor of the Council of Indies during the last 2 decades of the 18th century for any policies regarding the archipelago. Viana was born in 1730 in what is today the province of Álava in the Basque Country, in a low-ranking noble family. In fact, he belonged to the emerging group of new men, called Golillas and Manteístas, who competed for political power with the aristocracy with the advent of the Bourbon dynasty. They were especially important during the reigns of Ferdinand VI and Charles III, when both kings looked to regain the control of an autonomous empire and found in this cadre of men a way to wrest power from the aristocrats at home and the local colonial elites abroad. These men, although noble, depended entirely on royal favor for their social ascendance, and thus they were totally loyal to the king. But Viana's career was exceptional. Only a few men had such extensive imperial bureaucratic experience with such a wide geographical scope. He began as a Fiscal General de la Audiencia of the Philippines in 1759. He was promoted to Alcalde del Crimen in Mexico in 1768, and finally in 1777 got a position in the Consejo de Indias in Spain, where he will serve the king in different positions until his death in 1804. Viana got his first job in the Philippines thanks to the help of his brother-in-law, Andrés Martínez de Aguirre, who had served the Secretary of State, José de Carvajal Lancaster, one of the King's Ferdinand VI's prime ministers. Even though Martínez was already retired, his influence probably served him to secure a position for Viana. Viana was also aided by his attachment to the Basque clan of the Vizcaínos, an important political lobby with an extensive network around the empire that had helped him enter the University of Salamanca. Viana later married one of his daughters to Luis de Goyeneche, member of one of the most prominent families in this Basque network. This point is important in Viana's biography because it shows how individual and collective interests still shape imperial policy. Even among reformers like him, who favored new types of governance, but resorted to the old political dynamics. Viana took possession as a Fiscal General de la Audiencia on 20 September 1758. He arrived at the archipelago during Pedro Manuel de Arandia's governorship, a period of important transformations, including the ascendance of Chinese mestizo over Chinese in the leadership of some of the city guilds, as well as the authorities' failed attempt to establish a trading company, among others. In his 9 years as Fiscal, Viana authored at least 10 reports. His first report on the administrative, economic, and military situation of the Philippines denounced the corruption and the lack of operativity of the colonial system at many levels. Although he proposed practical solutions, he had not yet articulated a broad plan of reforms. It was not until after the English occupation of the Philippines, in which he played an important role together with Simón de Anda as the main tactician resisting and fighting the British, and the arrival of the interim governor Francisco de la Torre, and later the new governor José Raón, when his reports assume a wider scope. Especially in the three aforementioned texts, he attempted to draw a systematic and rational plan to improve the economy and the administration of the archipelago, to make the colony more self-sufficient and therefore more profitable. His Proyectista plan was inspired by works of Spanish political theorists, such as el Marqués de la Ensenada, Miguel de Zabala, and Jerónimo de Ustariz. Following a Proyectista structure, he first suggested a reorganization of the territory's taxes. This was done in the Apuntes, notes written in 1764. A second step, developed in the Demostración del Miserable Estado de las Islas Filipinas in 1765, offers solutions to increase the rentability of the colony with the creation of a trading company and curbing the church power. Finally, his second Demostración of 1766 contains a statistical description of the losses and gains that the crown could expect to experience if it applied the suggested economic policies and ideas defended in the two previous reports. The theoretical models that he used had been developed for Spain and specifically also for Cuba, because he read the Cuba report on the reforms that the crown was thinking to apply in Cuba, and that basically become kind of the blueprint for the rest of the empire. But Viana extrapolated them to resolve the Philippine problem. In so doing, he silenced the context and interest of power groups and conflicts in the archipelago. Instead of analyzing or explaining these, he merely decried them as corrupt or illegal or irregular practices, and as decadent those that appear to complicate governance and lower royal revenues. He therefore constructed an abstract or partial view of the colonial milieu, leaving out key political nuances. The reports did not present original thoughts or designs. Their merit was in how they articulate ideas, models, and information that circulated in the colonial bureaucracy and among local elites in Manila, threading them together in a coherent plan for the archipelago's economy. In terms of sources, this corpus of text was written using data contained in the archives of the Audiencia and provided by the officers of the colonial treasury, together with reports written by colonial subjects such Nicholas Norton and Francisco Javier Salgado, traders who had written and submit plans on matters that they believed they knew well. Therefore, Viana used information generated by the local bureaucracy as well as local private narratives to construct a master narrative that should form the basis of reforms that will improve the economic efficiency of the colony from an imperial vision. Although the three reports were well received by the Council of Indies, they met with the critiques of two people, the ex-oidor of the Philippine Audiencia, Pedro Calderón Enriquez, and the trader Francisco Javier Salgado. Moreover, the plan was paralyzed by the anti-reformist minister of the Indies, Julián de Arriaga. Viana's friend and colleague, and future governor of the Philippines, Simón de Anda Salazar, defended his grand plan for the archipelago. Thus, we see that the knowledge produced from a metropolitan point of view by centralizing and reformist bureaucrats still had to negotiate contending networks that connected metropolitan and local elites with competing interests. In fact, Viana's plan for the Philippines was put in a drawer and momentarily forgotten. It was not until the 1780s, when Viana was himself a member of the Council of Indies, that many of the ideas of his reports were implemented in the archipelago. This shift took place under Charles III and his ministers, and under the governorship of Vasco y Vargas, who had been sent to the Philippines with orders to begin a set of economic reforms, particularly the creation of the Royal Company of the Philippines and the tobacco monopoly that socioeconomically transformed Luzon. So, in conclusion, Viana's texts represent a Spanish 18th century example of knowledge production by a bureaucrat, a Newman, who was committed to the new political approach to the governance of the empire. Those texts had an approach that looked for the instrumentalized information to facilitate colonial administration and secure the imperial state's control over a vast political space. It was not, however, knowledge produced by the empirical study of the colonial territory in which he worked, for he fit the information that he gathered from locally produced sources into a theoretical frame that was partly foreign to the islands. In general, albeit of the historiography of the Spanish Empire, is just beginning to analyze the different ways of producing knowledge. There is still a need to explore more in depth how knowledge and knowledge production were created in spaces that were not colonized by British and other European powers in Southeast Asia. Possibly one of the reasons is the still pervasive Black legend around the Spanish Empire, but also another factor could be that those older empires, like the Spanish and the Portuguese, the state operated with early modern political dynamics, profoundly ingrained in those spaces after 200 years of colonization, making the application of British and other European models unfit to understand fully their policies and understanding of knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ruth Llobet. Our second speaker, for this afternoon is Dr. Aitor Anduaga. Dr. Anduaga is at present an Iker Basque research professor at the Basque Museum of the History of Medicine and Science at the University of the Basque Country in Leioa, Bilbao, Spain. For several years, he was also a visiting research associate at the Institute of Philippine Culture here at the Ateneo de Manila. This afternoon, he will present his research on trade networks and circulation of ideas, liberalism in the wake of the Royal Company in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Aitor Anduaga.
Thank you. Thank you for your nice words. Thanks. Just let me share the screen. Well, I think it's okay. Yeah, first, and I should like to thank the organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to participate in this event. And of course, I accepted the invitation with great pleasure. And I also extend my gratitude to Professor Francis Navarro for his support. In this talk, I will analyze how the employees of a chartered trading company supposedly experienced it in negotiating and buying, selling merchandise from Asia and America were able to become liberal reformists. In fact, as I will show today, they embrace, they transmit free trade ideas through which I will call microspaces of circulation of knowledge. The issue is of special relevance since there is, as far as I know, at least almost no study on the parallels between the developments of charter trading companies and economic liberalism. This is an apparently paradoxical phenomenon. As you know, charter companies are based on monopolistic privileges, while liberals tend or used to advocate for the total liberalization of trade. Today I will show that although the royal companies' pursuits were mainly commercial, they often included a good number of social activities, activities related to the production, transmission, transformation of knowledge, such as the drawing of reports, selling and dissemination of books, participation in intellectual circles, in economic societies, and so on and so on. These activities were headed by the royal company's factors. As you maybe know, a factor was an employee who was a representative of the company in the settlement enclaves, called factories or factorías in Spanish. Interestingly, At the beginning, the royal company's factors combine diplomatic functions with a vocation of royal service. However, as they engage in private businesses of profit, they abandon those original functions and began championing the freedom of private trade. As such, their behavior was liberal in many respects. Just let me start with a brief historical notes on what at that time was called the Real Compania de Filipinas. The Royal Company was the last of the great charter companies of the old regime. It was founded by King Charles III in 1785 in the framework of Bourbon reforms. It was established with two main objectives. First, promoting the Philippines' productive economy. And second, fostering direct and intra-Asian trade. But the company soon deviate from these original objectives and engage in private and speculative trade. The end of the galleon trade in 1815 restricted the royal company's access to American silver. Was its anima motrix, the American silver, and led some of its employees to redirect their private activities to the opium trade. The royal company was dissolved in 1834. It must be said that the royal company was basically the continuation of a Basque company, the Basque firm Real Compañía Guipuzcoana de Caracas. This continuation affected management, shareholding, capital, infrastructures, even the recruitment policy. The directors of the two companies were the same, and almost all their shareholders and factors as well. For example, it was in fact the Guipuzcoanas company's factors who came to represent the interests of the royal company, at least at the beginning of the company. The royal company placed Manila, as we can see here, at the hub of its Asian trade. It established there a governing board chaired by the Governor General of the Philippines, which was subordinate and dependent on that of Madrid. However, in a few years, some circumstances altered the company's plans. First, the company soon realized that obtaining a lucrative business from the archipelago would be quite difficult. We have to take in mind that by law, the royal company had to invest 4% of its gross profits in the Philippines. And second, they saw how the company lost its most precious monopoly. At that time, the crown liberalized the introduction of Indian cotton fabrics in the Iberian Peninsula. All this brought important changes. In the early 90s, the royal company closed its board in Manila, established a factory there for the first time, reformed the factory in Canton, which has been founded some years earlier, and opened a new one in Calcutta. That was in 1796. The point is that the royal company progressively deviated from the crown's initial ends and opened up to speculative trade, especially in America and from India to the peninsula. Well, as we can see in this map, in this illustration, with the establishment of its factories in Manila, Canton, and later in Calcutta, one might think that the company came to form a merchant network. This is what we can see here. But what kind of network was this? Historian of the Indian trade diaspora, Claude Markovits, has defined a merchant network as follows. According to him, it's a structure through which goods, credit, capital, and men circulate regularly across a given space, which can vary enormously in terms of both size and accessibility. Markovits' network model is monocentric, but multimodal with many nodes. However, the royal company's merchant network could be better characterized as a polycentric rather than monocentric network. Its central nodes, as we can see again here in the map, would consist of a cluster of factories established in Asia, but also in America, in Peru, in the peninsula, in Cadiz, and so on. There was no dominant center in this network. Another historian, this time French, KAPIL RAJ'S, here it is, wait, just here it is, suggests using a space analysis rather than network analysis. RAJ'S, in fact, defines spaces of circulation as sensitive spaces to the asymmetries of power. A space would be, according to him, a fabric with a cloud of relations rather than mere individual linkages. The concept of space of circulation, understood as the spaces of encounter and negotiation of knowledge that originate from cross-cultural interaction, is appropriate in many respects. But let me suggest another approach, which I think is even more appropriate for this particular context. I will adopt here a relational and microspace approach. The approach is microspatial. In which sense? Well, in the sense that it targets very specific people, a few factors, merchants, a few politicians, and it's also at the same time relational. While relational pays attention to the interactions between individuals and nodes, the microspace dimension addresses the individuals, nodes, and their worlds of interaction. Thus, microspaces of circulation denote forms of knowledge preserved by very, very small social groups within highly specific regimes, contexts that, of course, share given interests, ideals, values, royal links, family links, and so on. In this talk, I will show 3 examples of microspaces of circulation of liberal thought. The first is related to the royal company's bookstore. The second is a social microspace, as we will see. And the third is an institutional, related to the economic society of the Philippines. Let's start with the first, a liberal microspace related to the royal company's bookstore. As you maybe know, the enclave of Manila, on the route of the annual galleon, made the trade of books from European and Mexican presses have been, well, historically important in the Philippines. However, it's little known that the royal company established a bookstore in Manila. It was at once a library, a public library, not private like those of some religious orders, and a bookstore as a sales warehouse. It was located in Binondo, where the royal company's warehouses were. According to the commissioner of the Inquisition in Manila, at that time, there was no other public bookstore than that of the royal company. It's known, however, that this was not the first bookstore in the city. Chinese small-scale vendors used to trade books, and the Jesuits also, they housed a bookstore and operated their own press. However, the difference is this: the royal company reconceptualized the circulation of printed text at least at 2 levels, conceptual and circulatory. First, conceptually, while the religious orders had regarded the sale of books as a tool for evangelization, the royal company went a little bit further, elevating printed text to the category of merchandise for the general public. And second, at transport level, unlike the traditional system based on the transatlantic transport of goods, first from the peninsula to America and then from America to Asia via the galleon, the royal company also drew on intra-Asian merchant networks. importing English books from China and India and French books from places like the island of Mauritius. Moreover, the royal company had to confront the all-powerful Inquisition that regulated the flow of printed text until the suppression of this institution in 1821. Then the company was able to introduce a large number of prohibited books. It was in part, and I highlight in part, responsible for the dissemination of Enlightenment books in the Philippines, books on rationalism and anti-clericalism mainly. Let me show these two examples, Voltaire's Lettres philosophiques, which were introduced by the Royal Company, or the volumes of the Histoire de l'Académie Royale des Sciences de Paris. Let's see the second microspace, Communes social gatherings. This is related to the formation of microspaces of interpersonal test circulation in Manila. Thomas de Comín was one of the factors most engaged in this circulation. He had worked as a factor in Manila for many, many years, almost 15. He was an educated diplomat, staunch defender of the French Revolution. Educated in France, he had traveled through England and the Netherlands. In Madrid, he liked to frequent liberal literary gatherings, like those organized by liberal people like Manuel Godoy or the library of the Count of Tabarrús, who was the founder of the Royal Company. And in Manila, he socialized in similar circles. He used to visit the house of the Governor General Mariano Fernández de Folgueras, targeted by Creole sectors because of his connivance with French. However, one of the earliest contacts of Comín in Manila was the lawyer Íñigo González de Azaola, with whom, in Comín words, he said, I read around an hour and a half or 2 hours daily the works of Voltaire and Bayle, and among other philosophers during close to 3 years. Well, the fact is that Comín shared books, shared books with Azaola, and this fact was important because Azaola was not just a skilled merchant involved in the trading of Indian cotton for Mexico or even in the opium business. He was also one of the 9 delegates who represented the Philippines in the parliament, in the Cortes of Madrid. It was in 1813, 1814. At that time, Azaola was put on trial and spent 2 months in prison for having claimed the right to political representation of indigenous people and mestizos. The second microspace is, or the third, sorry, microspace is related to the economic society of the Philippines, which is this. Well, I think I forgot. Yeah, I realize now, sorry to the listeners. The economic society of the Philippines was the responsible for this third microspace. It was inspired by the Royal Company in many aspects. The economic society, I will give you some examples, had more than 20 members linked to the company, to the Royal Company, almost 20% in 1824. Almost all members wanted to overcome the old regime's mercantilist policies. They share the same liberal tenets: trade liberalization, the end of monopolies in the home sector, and the restriction of foreign mercantile activities. The fact is that the process of establishing an economic society was born before the Royal Company itself in 1785, more or less. Its objectives were to introduce commercial cultivation, promote farming methods, planting tobacco, coffee, sugar, rather than the traditional crops like corn or rice. It must be said that the Royal Society was re-established 30 years later, in 1819, but this time the political stimulus came from Governor Fernández de Folgueras. As we saw, a presumed afrancesado who had close ties with the royal company factors. He was a close friend of Comín, and father-in-law of the first director of the Economic Society, Manuel Bernaldez Pizarro. Bernaldez Pizarro had worked as a factor in Canton before becoming judge, oidor, in Manila. Well, what I want to highlight here in this section is that the existence of a microspace for the circulation of ideas can be seen in three indicators: distribution of books, reports by its members, and technology. Let us start with books. Just I have not too much time, I give you a couple of examples. For instance, in 1823, the Society distributed over 1,000 copies of grammar, orthography, notebooks on history, on popular industry, and to the public, all of them free of charge, to boost literacy. Moreover, the Society published the monthly magazine Registro Mercantil de Manila, which provided for the first time commercial and shipping information from, well, almost 10 years, 24 to 33. The second indicator concerns reports. I can say that by the late 1830s, its members produced more than 25 reports and statements covering sectors as diverse as spices, mining, manufacturing, etc. We can find reports from the establishment of a paper mill, cultivation and production of opium, a mint, the opening of the port of Manila to foreign cottons. We essays on the cultivation of indigo, rice, abaca, well, many. But it must be said that all these reports were advisory, not executive. All were proposals, suggestions, recommendations delivered to the Governor General and the Madrid government. And this was to be the central contradiction of the 19th century economic liberalism, the bridge between technical possibility and economic feasibility. Finally, technology. And the Society sessions also were or became a space through which technology and educational training ideas circulated. The goal was to improve the Philippines' industries and manufacturers. This included the acquisition of foreign technology. Examples were spinning machines from the US, husking machines, rice husking machines from Spain. And it also included the establishment of technical chairs, an academic chair of agriculture as a project, or a school of drawing as early as 1823. This was suppressed 9 or 11 years later for lack of funds. Well, it's time for a few conclusions. Firstly, the royal company factors became impellers of microspaces of circulation of liberal ideas. This was because their original functions were altered by the boom of opium trade and their engagement in intra-Asian or country trade. It must be said that the role of the royal company in the building of the co-construction of spaces of liberal thought was somewhat paradoxical. It's, in my view, a matter at once curious and by no means obvious. I say by no means obvious because it is from the very ranks of a company enjoying monopolistic privileges that demands for trade liberalization arose. And I would say curious because the royal company factors involved in the opium trade were key in this process as they turned against the very company that had sheltered them or protect them until then. Finally, the royal company factors involved in the opium trade were precisely those who most vehemently, vigorously called for economic liberal reforms in the Philippines. And that's all. Maraming salamat, salamat kayo, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anduaga. Our third speaker for this afternoon is Miss Felice Prudente Santamaria. Miss Santamaria is an internationally awarded author of nonfiction and has been a cultural worker for over 5 decades. Her interest in food has led her to a serious and pioneering effort of tracing the history of Philippine culinary culture during the colonial era. This year, Miss Felice Prudente Santamaria was awarded the Gawad Tanglaw ng Lahi by the Ateneo de Manila University for her life's important work on Filipino culture and identity. This afternoon, she will share with us the lure of liking and being liked, Philippine cuisine at the turn of the 19th century. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Felice Prudente Santamaria.
Good afternoon, everyone. In order to determine what of Spanish cuisine stayed in Filipino cuisine after 333 years of colonization, we can look at the first recipe books to be published after the Spanish era ended. Food is popular culture, and this brief presentation attempts to show what of Spanish cuisine became part of Filipino popular culinary culture at the commencement of the 1900s, and to decipher if Spanish-influenced cuisine communicated any cultural messages. Psychologists promote that likability is a key predictor to success in all areas of life. There is also the likes attract hypothesis, suggesting that social homogamy may create likability. Colonial structures, whether intentionally or not, attract the colonized to mimic characteristics of the dominant colonials. Even within a framework of colonial mentality, which this presentation will not deal with, perhaps likability and being liked is a psychological means for the colonized to fit into and even advance within the colonial social hierarchy. The food aspect of culture could be relaying that Filipinos had acquired Spanishness, whether they wanted to be Spanish-like or not. Liking Spanish had a practical side to it. Although the native, simple, everyday meal of rice and a piece of fish was constantly stereotyped as poor and even demeaned by the colonizers, there is no evidence that Hispano-American and Spanish cuisines were forced into Philippine cuisine. It seems that Indios and Mestizos determined what they liked from the foreign, what of the foreign they would accept and continue to nativize. The only dietary laws introduced, promoted, and even enforced systematically were those of the Catholic Church for fasting, feasting, and abstinence. At the start of conversion, Indios were considered children of their new religion. Missionaries promoted church culinary practices only more strictly only once the natives began living close to each other and the parish priest in a parish pueblo. Indios became even very conscious to the rules that devout women were concerned about chewing betel nut on days of fasting. And this was in the 1500s yet. It was ruled that chewing was all right as long as one did not swallow the seed. In terms of convenience, convenient provisions for journeys were useful to everyone. Indios learned that Spanish adobo was a good provision when missionaries and soldiers traveled. Adobo means marinade or a pickling solution. Spaniards marinated meats in vinegar before cooking them, thereby helping to prolong the food's edibility. Filipinos had not been marinating as a step before cooking, but Filipinos had the existing tradition of cooking fish in vinegar, such as paksiw. Philippine adobo, even today, is cooked in two ways. One, the Spanish way, and secondly, the paksiw way. Among the endemic Mexican botanicals that started growing wild in the Philippines was tomato. It originally was a sour type that became popular for sinigang along with or instead of local souring agents such as tamarind fruit, batuan pulp, or alibangbang leaves. So you can see that it slid in very easily. Easy to prepare is Spanish puchero. It is made just like native sabaw and tinola by boiling ingredients in a liquid. Puchero is very flexible, as we will see even in the Americas. It is so flexible because it can use whatever mixed meats and vegetables are available. The puchero broth can acquire a mild sweetishness by adding native saba bananas. The folk practice of serving dipping sauces with puchero was not counter to either culture. Natives used shrimp sauce like patis, and the Spanish added mashes and a cooked tomato sauce. What were substituted for native ingredients in jeopardy? Well, corn was one of them. It was introduced where rice did not grow well. But while corn began growing in some parts of the archipelago, it never became a total substitute for rice. It did, however, become a rice extender, being added in the form of, in a ground form, to the rice. Even chunks of the New World tubers were cooked into rice in times when rice was scarce, so they were also appreciated. Those are just some of the examples of Spanish Empire ingredients and foods that became part of Filipino cuisine with little difficulty, and perhaps without any intent to be Spanish-like. Some of the Spanish foods, here we are, that easily assimilated. Well, missionary memoirs and colonial era dictionaries point out similarities between Hispano and Indio cuisines. Colored rice, for instance, was eaten during pre-Christian fiestas in the Visayas. Arroz a la Valenciana is made golden by saffron, but in the Philippines, native kasubha was substituted. Similarly, coning is yellow from turmeric and is a celebratory dish. And coning was not just limited to Mindanao, it was also eaten in the Visayas. So arroz a la Valenciana and paella are also Philippine fiesta fare today, just like coning and other colored rices. Lechon is the Spanish word for pig. It's not a Filipino word. Note that the native words for pig and roasting, such as the Tagalog inihaw na baboy, they are not used when we refer to the fiesta pig. Missionaries may have used lechon when speaking about pig for celebrations, thereby embedding the word into the many languages of Christianized Filipinos. Missionaries were looking for Philippine synonyms for words like escabeche, because again, the use of vinegar, and they identified paksiw. We have talked a little about puchero earlier. It's a native broth. It was similar to native broths. Now, dried and salted cod is called bacalao. We know it as bacalao in Spanish. And many island fish were also dried, salted, or smoked to extend their edibility. Drying fish was done, in fact, during prehistoric times. So the desire for trying a Spanish type of daing, for instance, or a Spanish type of tuyo may have been of interest to the natives. We have many Mexican botanicals, but not many Mexican dishes. Partly because the iconic ingredients of Mexican dishes, like cactus, would not grow in our tropical climate. There is a Philippine tamales, and it is very different from a Mexican tamal. Missionaries who had waited for their galleon to Manila at Mexico, or those who had been assigned to work in Mexico, likely wanted to find an Asian equivalent of tamal. Because for one thing, tamal was a portable food, something they could bring with them as they visited their missions. The ubiquitous Mexican prototype is made of corn dough wrapped in corn husk. The Philippine nativized tamal is made of native rice flour and coconut milk, plus New World annatto coloring and ground peanut. In the 1600s, Philippine tamal was topped by fish. In addition, it now uses chicken and pork that were unknown in Mexico till they were introduced during the Spanish era. In contrast, chicken and pig were pre-colonial culinary ingredients in the Philippines. Early missionaries called suman the Philippine tamal. In a way, we also have other portable rice dishes like patil from Mindanao, but patil is an assembly of rice plus a viand, and then all wrapped together, whereas tamales and suman, everything is cooked together in the rice wrapper. Patil or patel has survived over time, like tamales, like suman, because of its usefulness, its practicability, its savor, and thus its likability. But while liking food can be due to practical considerations, as we've just cited, it is also very subjective. It is very personal. Foods of the foreign leadership became aspirational the longer the colonial relationship lasted, and the more widespread the foreign foods became. Foreign foods had become societal expectations, in fact, part of an internalized social norm. By the 19th century, the era of Rizal, the original highly segregated culinary groups of the 16th and 17th centuries were now interacting. We had Indios who later incorporated mestizos de sangre. Their food development used to be different, separate from the food of the Sanglis and the Parians, for instance, and the Pariancillos. And then there were the Hispanics, a third group, which was subdivided yet into two groups. There were the rich traders and the civil military leadership who wanted to have food like that in Europe. But then there were also the salaried soldiers, the shipbuilders, and the missionaries who did not have the same means as the rich traders. Now the foods of those once segregated groups was starting to mingle. The lure of imported ingredients also may have been due to their expanded possibilities to please one's taste and textural desires. Take sourness and saltiness, as you can see on the screen. Both tastes were considered dominant in Indio cooking by the Spanish. Actually, I'm very happy about that. I don't think we would want bitterness to be among the characteristics of Filipino cuisine. The presence of 5 different sets of taste buds, each set specific for detecting only one of the 5 common tastes, continues to be questioned. But one thing for sure, is that Filipino languages have traditional native words for the long-standing four common tastes of salty, sour, sweet, and bitter. The four tastes are present in native cuisine, and Spanish words for them never overtook the native. The fifth and newest of common tastes is umami. Natural glutamates that please the desire for umaminess are strong in native coconut milk dishes considered malinamnam or delicious. Now, beef, cow milk, and its products like cheese and butter are rich in umami. Perhaps that is why they embedded themselves in Philippine cuisine, although when natives first tasted cow beef, they did not like it. Cow was introduced during the Spanish period, and I'm just imagining that poor cow, those poor cows on board the galleons in the middle of a storm. Now, tomato, when cooked, tomato is very rich in umami also. And I put there the guisado. You know, guisado making is truly one of the most important additions to Philippine culture from Spain. It is guisado, it gives us all those slow cooked and saucy dishes that do bring out natural glutamates. Pan frying, the meat, the bones, the vegetables, and all of this also releases glutamates. And the sofrito, with which we start the guisado process. The sofrito in the Philippines being onion, garlic, and tomato. That is what we call naggigisa, and that brings out umaminess also. Now, natives enjoyed sweetness that in pre-colonial times was very simple. It was satisfied by sugarcane juice, honey, and ripe fruits. Sugarcane sugar was made possible by milling technology introduced by missionaries during the Spanish era. European candies and pastries became increasingly popular as natives learned to make them. Food was also perked up during the Spanish era. The cacao plant was brought for propagation just before the first colonial century ended. And cooking chocolate before that, it had been imported. But once cacao took root and the idea of chocolate became a popular beverage, then caffeine was now embedded in Philippine diet. Coffee followed. Other Spanish-era botanicals and culinary techniques made local foods piquant and visually attractive. In the mid-19th century, carinderia food was all golden. They had gone crazy with annatto coloring. That was how popular it had become. Now, cuisine became a means to communicate a change in social-political aspirations. Indios and mestizos gentrified and acquired urbanidad, especially when 18th century concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity were revitalized throughout the 19th century. The Philippine Revolution began in 1896. And on September 29, 1898, Filipino leadership seeking separation from the Spanish Empire hosted an event to ratify the proclamation of Philippine independence made on June 12th earlier that year. It was fundamental and necessary that Filipinos be seen as equal to not only the Spanish, but all peoples who were free of colonial shackles. The lunch, especially, and the dinner that night were public relations events for the new Philippine Constitutional Republic, the first in Asia. The meals were prepared under management of the Pampangan's Master Chef Emilio Gonzalez and pastry maker Juan Senson. Both supervised meals for the renowned Arnedo family of Sulipan, Pampanga. The Arnedos had entertained visiting royalty like a prince and a duke. Their cuisine combined native and foreign. It was what Chef Jean Gonzalez calls, who is, by the way, a descendant of the Arnedos, calls Alta Culinaria Filipina. Wines were employed in cooking, along with complex cooking techniques, no longer just the roasting and the boiling of 1521. Filipino cooking showed off the best in Philippine urbanidad cuisine. While Spanish and other European foods and beverages became available, they did not displace favored Filipino food, earlier Philippine food. The three earliest post-Hispano-colonial recipe books combine cooking of the folk, gentry with farms in rural areas, professionals and entrepreneurs in Manila, with the foods of the residents with means. One found the simple bread bun and the elaborate Mallorcan ensaimada introduced by Spain equally popular with native rice cakes. There was also the pollo con chocolate, as well as pancit, caldereta, and even bucayo. As you see on the screen, those 15 dishes, plus sinigang and adobo, were present in the cookbooks. Those 15 dishes were already considered Filipino, Tagalog, and native. Filipinos claimed ownership for all the foods in the recipe books, regardless where their prototypes came from. Filipino cuisine at the end of the Spanish colonial era had taken foods of the empire, ingredients of the empire, and made them foods of the Philippine Republic. Food and beverage still contribute to defining and popularizing a country brand. Cuisine communicates.
Thank you very much, Ms. Felice Santa Maria. And thank you very much to all our speakers, Dr. Ruth Del Llobet, Dr. Aitor Anduaga, and Ms. Felice Prudente Santa Maria. At this point, I'd like to open our discussion for this afternoon. Let us begin by our participants from our Zoom room, our conference participants who are joining us from our Zoom room. We have a question from we have a question for Dr. Ruth Del Llobet. Can you give an example of locally produced knowledge from local elites or local traders, as mentioned by VIANA?
So far, the two documents that he uses from local elites is the one of Nicole Norton and then the one of Salgado. It is quite, so far I was not able by name to discern other sources, at least like kind of informal sources. It's quite difficult. However, he was a man that he was in good terms with many sectors of the society because he was extremely honest and very very hardworking. When they did the juicio de residencia, they could not find a single point of corruption against him. So yeah, it was almost a rarity. So I think that's the reason, because he wanted to leave the Philippines. He was the poor man. He was already like in a heart attack all the time because like he was so by the book and so so thorough and so honest. So at some point he was like completely burned out of the situation. But basically, his main sources for like kind of is Salgado, which was a Creole, was actually, when I use the word Creole for the Philippines, is actually perfectly okay. Criollos call themselves criollos. So this doesn't have the negative connotation that it has in Latin America or in South America. That's an important thing because I have noticed it many times. My area of expertise is the Constitution of 1812. And all the construction of how that sets off the liberalism and Filipino liberalism and also politics within the Philippines. And then one of the things I have explored a lot is Ruiz Rodriguez Varela, Ventura de los Reyes, many of these people. And then they are all the time in the documents calling themselves criollos. So Salgado was a criollo. And Nichols Norton, even though he was a man, I think he was a British, yeah. He nonetheless is this type of man that he creolized, like he even died in the Philippines. So it is basically those type of men that ended up being Filipinos by adoption. So those are the two sources that he mentions. And what is interesting is he mentions Salgado. However, Salgado criticized him, so it was against his point of view. So, but he also used the Royal Treasury in the Philippines, and I assume he was a man that had other informants. The only thing is, like, if they were not rationalizing documentation in which he could prove to the king that the information was true, he will not mention it. He will make it as his own opinion, of his own take. You're muted, Patrick.
Patrick, you're mute. You have to unmute yourself.
I can't hear you, Patrick.
I'm sorry. We have another question from our Zoom room, this time for Dr. Anduaga. Dr. Anduaga, our participants from the Zoom room would like to know if the books that were sold in the bookstore were all in the Spanish language, or were there other languages? And what happened to the bookstore afterwards?
Yeah.
Well, I see that the focus of interest is in the Royal Company's bookstore, which means that probably most people didn't know about the existence of this bookstore. I was also surprised. I have to be frank and to say that when I read about it, I was really surprised. The point is, this is not, of course, it's not my research topic, the bookstore in Manila, founded by the Royal Company, but it was the topic of a doctoral dissertation carried out by Matthew Hill at the University of Texas. He wrote on, it was printing press and book circulation or in the Philippines, in the Spanish Philippines.
Okay.
It's a very extensive dissertation where I think you can find many things about it. And it must be said, I must be say that most of books were in English and French. They came from China, as I explained in my talk, from China, from the island of Mauritius, and then this was the most common language used by traders to introduce the books. I have no exact information about what happened with this bookstore. I know, according to the sources given by Hill, the first mention, for example, of the company of book selling activities are from the 80s, 1780s. It's a report just when the Royal Company was established. It seems that in a couple of years the trade of books started, and even when I mentioned in my talk the words of the Inquisitor, Nicolas Cora, saying that there is in Manila another library or bookstore. This was in 1803, and even the example of Tomás de Comín, saying that he sold books. He was a factor. He sold books. It was in the 1812, 1813. That is, it seems that the period was long, at least a couple of decades, selling books. We have to take into account that the Royal Company closed its activities in 1832. Probably in the 20s, everything was, well, activities were low down. Then this is what I can say about this interesting question. I don't know if this answer, at least in part, the question posed by the listener.
Dr. Anduaga, there's a comment on our Zoom chat. No? It's amazing how Dr. Anduaga moved from cyclones and earthquakes to trade with the liberalism and knowledge production. Can you explain this shift?
Well, yeah, this is a big shift, and even it's not obvious for me. I was researching on I am a historian of science and technology also. I was interested in the Jesuit contribution to the geophysical science knowledge in the Philippines. But at that time, I really saw that. At that time, I was interested in the production of knowledge, practices, services, techniques, and circulation also. But I remember that by circulation, I didn't understand the communication or transmission of ideas. Rather, it was processes of encounter, of transformation, of mutation, adaptation, appropriation of knowledge, in which I was most interested. And I see that some companies, trading companies, adopted and appropriate ideas from the Western and apply for particular conditions. In particular, a company came to my mind is the East India Company, and its role in the development of a colonial bureaucracy in India. You know, the British colonization of India was initiated by a British trading company, East India Company. It was a private consortium of London merchants who held the lucrative monopoly of British trade. And this company progressively established itself as of course, a commercial establishment, but then acquired and governed some territories in the region. The territories controlled by the company had expanded from Bengal and coastal possessions such as Mumbai, Madras, and then large lands of the Indian subcontinent. And some historians, like KAPIL Raj and many others, show that the employees of this trading company were able to become imperial bureaucrats. They were traders, but they became imperial bureaucrats and successfully administered the acquired territories. And I thought, this is a good example of the similarities between the vocations of merchants and bureaucrats. But in my case, I was interested in the similarities between the vocations of traders and liberal reformists. And I thought that there could be certain similarities between the two cases. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions from our YouTube channel and from the Facebook page of the National Quincentennial Commission. So from YouTube, we have a question. This is for Miss Felice Santa Maria. How about Spanish or Mexican food? What Philippine indigenous ingredients have become part of their mainstream.
You mean Filipino ingredients that went abroad?
Yes, yes, to Spain and to Mexico.
Right. Well, I've done a little bit of a talk on that. Of course, Mexico credits the Philippines for its tuba, and it has tuba fresca, which is non-alcoholic, and then it has its equivalent of our distilled tuba. No, so the coconuts on the western side of Mexico are like our coconuts. The bottoms are rounded, but the coconuts on the eastern side are pointy because they came via the African route. So the use of coconut in Mexican cooking on the western side is different from that on the eastern side, which is now African or African influenced. And it seems that because of the Filipinos who jumped ship and who settled in the area of Colima and all of that on the west coast, that their use of coconut milk in their cooking has been adopted by the Mexicans. No? I mean, that's the most prominent, and I'm very thankful that Mexican heritage cooking credits the Philippines. They said, it's this tuba that really came our way. So that's the most important. But quite early, Legazpi was still alive, and the first tamarind trees were brought from the Philippines to Acapulco, and then 5 years later, we see a report that the tamarind trees were growing in Acapulco. Also, ginger, they were bringing ginger cuttings from here, ginger plants from here, hoping that they would grow in Mexico. The idea was to get the spices growing in Mexico so they would be closer to the market. Now, there are many other things, but that's a whole talk in itself.
That's right. Thank you very much. Ms. Felice, we have another question. Do you suppose that the influences from from Spanish cuisine affected why Philippine cuisine never became as spicy as our neighbors like Thailand and Indonesia?
That really remains a big mystery for everyone. But if you study the Philippine food before the Spanish came, it doesn't seem to have wanted piquancy. But the other thing people forget is that Philippine food is really a do-it-yourself meal. We have something cooked, but we always have these little side dishes with what people now call dipping sauces, which could be relishes, pickles, sauces, vinegars, whatever, flavored vinegars. And so the Filipino does not cook the piquancy into the food. Instead, you have the option to add the piquancy as you wish. In fact, in one of my recent IG posts about Pampanga, I noticed that there is a word out of the 1700s, this era that all three of us are talking about. It's a word that means putting chili into the food when you know that the person who's gonna eat it does not like the food to be piquant. So you see, that's terrible, no? That's really terrible. But that's why we need to also understand that in Filipino cuisine, we can add as much chili as we want, but we add it according to our personal liking. I think that angle has not really been studied.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Felice. There's a question here for Dr. Ruth del Llobet. Did Francisco Leandro de Viana collaborate with others like Juan de Cuellar, for example? Are they from the same period?
Juan de Cuellar, the scientist.
Yeah, the scientists, yes. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm concentrate basically with the analysis of this work. What I'm concentrating is an understanding in the moment and the context that the document is created. Then there is a second part of that document is the projection that has, historically speaking, where because it became the blueprint for the Bourbon reforms in the 18th century. Like the Compañía, La Real Compañía de Filipinas, actually the first page of the document is a letter from Viana to the king, explaining the importance of creating this company. And actually, he literally they copy literally the first 2 pages of the letter. So I assume had to knew him. Viana was he married, his wife was a Mexican criolla, la Marquesa de Villaverde, no, Marquesa, I don't remember right now the title, but her father was actually El Rey del Pulque in Mexico. So there was a very prominent and very rich family. So possibly they cross paths, but so far I have not found any document connecting both of them.
Patrick, I can say something about Juan de Cuellar,
yeah,
if you want.
Yes, please, Dr. Anduaga.
Because he was a scientist, a botanist, and then and it's very interesting person. And the historical episode also is quite sad but interesting. And the point is that I said that well, in this circulation of ideas, objects, and so on, goods were not limited to commodities or even merchandise. Also included, as you know, well, items like books, plants, scientific objects, technical objects, and so on. And I think that the case of Cuellar, this Spanish naturalist, well illustrates the circulation of scientific information and objects in these networks, trading networks in the Philippines. And the point is that the Real Jardín Botánico of Madrid, together with the crown, the Spanish crown, was interested in or wanted to exploit Philippine plants, in particular one, cinnamon, to compete with the European companies, especially Dutch, French, British, in the space trade. And to this end, they formed a botanical commission of the Philippines, which was not a typical scientific expedition. The crown financed it, the state financed the commission, and the botanist who led the commission was Juan de Cuellar, who was at the same time an employee, not factor, but an employee of the Royal Company. And one of the missions entrusted to Cuellar was to periodically send some Chinese object to Spain, to the Real Gabinete of Natural History in Madrid. The point is that Cuellar, he arrived in the Philippines, drew on the merchant network organized by the Royal Company. And he used that to contact a Chinese missionary, a Mandarin missionary, who was working in Canton, and then among them established the circuit. The circuit was like this. The Royal Company factors in Canton paid the cost of the objects acquired by the missionary and sent them on the Royal Company ships to Manila. In Manila, Cuellar classified, ordered these objects before boarding them on the same company ships to Spain, to Cadiz, and then from Cadiz were delivered to the Real Gabinete of Madrid. And the point is that the Real Gabinete of Natural History received hundreds and hundreds of Chinese objects in the 90s, and to a lesser extent, objects from the Philippine tribes also. But before finishing, I have to say that, and this is the sad side of this story, that Cuellar never felt the Royal Company's support or understanding. this was due in part to the royal company's eagerness for quick and lucrative business, but also to the zeal with which I think the royal company judged Cuellar's dedication to the mission entrusted by the crown. I would say that Cuellar was, well, a victim of power relationships between the crown on the one side and the royal company with, of course, its own interest in trade by the other.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Anduaga. A special shout out again to our viewers from the Facebook page of the National Quincentennial Commission. We have a few questions for Miss Felice Santa Maria. How about Sancucha? Also a part of Spanish colonial influence on our cuisine?
That we haven't traced that yet. I have written about that. No, we haven't really tracked that yet. Not yet. Not, or how shall I put it? I haven't tracked it enough to be able to say something with written evidence about it. Let's put it that way.
Thank you very much. Another question, Ms. Felice. How would the technology of taste have been incorporated to Filipino cuisine? Was it through Filipino wives of Spanish husbands cooking his preferences, or through household help of Spanish wives later in the colonial period?
Well, you have to understand that we had over 3 centuries of a developing interaction between ingredients, technologies, that would influence Philippine food. But it wasn't as if it was not an instantaneous interaction of everything all at once. You would have a few ingredients maybe being brought by someone on a galleon, and the missionary would try to plant it. Would it grow? Would it grow? And so it's not that simple. My forthcoming book talks a little about that. But you need to understand that it's not as if all of a sudden our taste buds are awakened by Mexican type cooking, or Hispano-American type cooking, or peninsular cooking. No, it isn't like that. First, we even need to get interested in the ingredients. You see, tomato was the red tomato was considered poisonous in Europe. And it wouldn't be brought here either unless it already had it had settled into the Spanish cuisine. So it's not instant. That's the whole point of the talk, is that it happens little by little, and the interaction is not even. It's only where you do have Hispanic people and Filipino in Indios mixing. It wasn't as if they were mixing all the time. Like I said, there were 4 different cuisines evolving separately. And it was only much later, when all the 4 cuisines came together, they had chances to mix. So I wish it were as simple as that. No, it's not.
Ms. Felice, there's another one from our YouTube live stream. Perhaps this is from a younger audience, no? Recently, there were memes, no? There were memes on Facebook and on social media about the different food in the Philippines, but having the same base, which is tomato sauce, no? There's a confusion between mechado, afritada, menudo, caldereta, no? And they are confused, no? Especially the younger generation. No? So
everybody's confused.
that's true. So probably it was a comment, no? Not a question, but probably, well, we wouldn't want you to differentiate those names, no? But
Let me
do you
just,
have a
okay,
comment
let me
on
just add. First of all, we're talking about tomato sauce. Okay, tomato sauce, tomato paste, which are 20th century ingredients. The earlier forms, and in Spain, you will read the earlier forms, the pre-Columbian, had no tomato in them. Okay, then the tomato comes in. And the tomato that comes in has to be cooked into it. I mean, you know, in other words, they seem to be tomato-based today. And that's probably all that it seems like that's what they have in common. But they also have the fact that they're stews, that they're guisados, the slow cooking. Although now we cook them instantly, but the real way to do that gives us sabores that is very, very delicious. So, yes, it is confusing because they're all stews. And if you look at the recipes for estofados, for guisados, for all of these mechados, etc., they're all different. It's like Filipino cooking. You have adobo, it's all different. Or you look at the Spanish recipe books. I'm sure that my two friends here will say the same thing. You look, they have regional differences, just as we have. They have different ingredients, just as we have. So it's not that it's really confusion. It's that it is personal interpretation, regional interpretation, provincial interpretation, and interpretation based on the historical era in which it is being cooked.
Thank you very much, Ms. Felice. We have a question from the Zoom room for Dr. Ruth de Llobet. Would arbitrismo be an applicable description for today's politics?
That's a good point.
Wow.
Where? In which context? Well, I think maybe globally, if we have to get like completely and absolutely into the context of nowadays, possibly, yeah. Arbitrismo was a style, as proyectismo wanted. It is the heir of this arbitrismo of the 17th century, and basically it was a style that, even though it gave some authors that they were very serious, and actually the arbitrismo of the early 18th century, before all the rationalization through numbers started taking over the documentation in the 40s and the 30s of the 18th century, there is arbitristas that they are like trying to prove their points. However, generally, as basically, this is Prudente has a great his book is a great book to read. The most important thing was at the end to satisfy or to the interest of a personal interest of like, or networks, or a network that you belong. So and then the king was not really so interested in exploiting the territory in a systematic way, as we will see with the Bourbons. So arbitrismo, yeah, in 17th century, some arbitristas could be fantasy literature. You can even say that's fantasy literature at times, because there was no base in reality. Many times there are arbitristas that they talk about the colonies, and they have never been in America. So that's so it is a genre that is kind of like the father of proyectismo, but at the same time it has been always like perceived more like a political strategic move in some ways, not so much like the proyectismo in the 18th century, that is a much more serious. That will be like proyectismo. Maybe that will be the attempts of academia to try to help the arbitrismo of nowadays. If we have to put it a little bit, a kind of a funny note to the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Llobet. For Dr. Anduaga, also from our Zoom room, in relation to the books from the Real Compania, now, was there a way to note the spread of the printed material to local people?
Yeah. Well, that's not It's a little bit complex topic, and with some ramifications, I would say. Just, I would like to mention several aspects. The documents or the files found regarding the Royal Company's bookstore are found, as far as I know, in the National Archives of Mexico, Archivo General de Mexico. And these files have been researched by Hill, the Matthew Hill, who, as I said, published a dissertation on this topic. I don't remember. I remember when I read his work saying that well, the information about the traffic of the audience was scarce. The point is that the files and the documents are found in the archives of in the fall of the Inquisition, such as this institution, and then there were cases open to well, employees or factors or people from the Philippines, but there is not much information about that topic. I don't know if maybe Llobet can help me in this point, or I have not precise data about. No.
Sorry, what, could you repeat the question?
The question is, was there a way to note if the books from the Real Compania bookstore spread to the locals?
Well, there is one thing that is common, is gossip. I remember I found an Inquisition, actually an Inquisition document in the archives of Mexico, in which there was a doctor, a French doctor that was living in Manila at that time, that he received like a bunch of books from Mauritius, and then that they were, of course, of revolutionary nature. And then he basically had been talking with a criollo and a man that it seems, they don't specify in documentation if he was a native or he was a mestizo or he was a Chinese mestizo. And then they were talking about like the Inquisition followed them and then basically traced where those books went, find the French doctor, and then the French doctor was questioned, and he said, no, I have only this conversation with these two people about those books. So many times, for example, during the 1820s, there is one of the men that is sent to Spain as kind of like the conspirators that Folgueras and Martinez sent to Spain in 1822, 23. Actually, one of them was caught because he was basically talking in a pharmacy. So the places, also there were dinners. So there was all this informal way of connecting ideas. Also, like I was talking precisely with Dr. Anduaga the other day, in which, for example, with the freedom of press in 1814, what happens is many pasiones that they are not sanctioned by the church permeate in the countryside. So for example, the revolt of Tayabas is inspired in the Pasión Pilalpil, which was actually entered in the countryside in 1814 when the Constitution allowed the freedom of press. However, it was a Pasión that was not accepted by the church. So the transmission of ideas, yeah, it was possibly because many think that the structure of the administration, like the upper echelons of the administration were controlled by the Spaniards, but the middle and low echelons of the administration, the escribanos and everything, they were Filipinos, they were native Filipinos, or they were Chinese mestizos, or they were criollos mexicanos, or criollos Filipinos. So there was possibly, the only thing is this type of information that we only find in documentation indirectly, no so much obviously, and as possibly kind of tracing the circulation of books.
Thank you very much. We have questions from our participants from the Zoom room, but we would like to call them to ask you the questions themselves or their comments. Let's first call on Father Tony.
Well, thank you. Thank you
Only
so much.
Castro.
Yeah, and thank you to all the speakers. It's kind of, I'm just curious about, it's the first time I've heard terms like arbitrismo, proyectismo, and of course, economic liberalism, of course, in the late 18th century, and of course in the 19th century as well. But they all seem to reflect changes brought about by the movements identified with the European Enlightenment, right? In France and in Germany, in other places as well. But perhaps my question really has to do with how these ismos really, whether they really had any political traction, you know, whether they, the political and the economic and the liberal exchange of ideas, this is certainly evident, and particularly in the Philippines, in the second half of the 19th century, we see this so much more clearly. But I was wondering about political developments, though, elsewhere. So the French Revolution would take place toward the end of that century. Spain would begin to lose many of its colonies in Latin America. And therefore, and of course, the political turmoil in Spain itself during the whole of the 19th century. So do you think these ismos of arbitrismo, proyectismo, and how do you see them playing out politically in Spain? And if you see any kind of expressions of this, they seem to be in conflict. These ideas are in conflict with each other in Spain, but also their effects elsewhere, like in the Philippines.
If you allow me, I think this question can be answered by Professor Anduaga and me. I will introduce it, and because Professor Anduaga and I were basically doing, in some ways, we're exploring. The other day we were talking, and we were talking about the puzzle, and then each of us is exploring a different piece of the puzzle. And then in here, this conversation, we will need a third person that is not present in this conference, Ander Permanier, who has done a wonderful work on opium and the traders of the Real Compania de Filipinas and all the triangulation between Canton, Manila, Xiamen, Calcutta. And then I have done on the Constitution of 1812 and this type of things. The arbitrismo and the proyectismo, they are basically kind of genres that they are like imperial genres, in a sense that is the style of how do you write in that period. Arbitrismo is much more something of the 17th century. Proyectismo is an 18th century, is an 18th century style of economic writing. And what we see is that VIANA'S text is a kind of like a classic type of text in Proyectismo. However, in the Philippines, you have the text that Nicolas Norton or Salgado sends to the king has this Proyectismo style of writing. It is present in the Philippines and is well known. They know it's in some ways the official way to address the court and to address the institutions. Regarding liberalism, it is a much more complex game. On one hand, as Dr. Anduaga is exploring about the company, and then also how those liberal ideas circulate around the company, then they have also, as he mentioned to me, and maybe he can elaborate a little bit more, an impact on Filipino liberalism. I will say that, and I will argue, and actually I argue that in my dissertation about the 1812 Constitution, is that actually Filipino liberalism begins in 1820. And then that is well proved because Rizal in the first issue de la Solidaridad, if you go to the second page, the first thing that he mentions is the importance of the 1812 Constitution to understand the struggle, the political struggle in the Philippines since the time of Gomburza, but even before. So the generation of Gomburza and the mid-18th century and the late 19th century, they are very aware of what happened in 1812. And then even at the first, we were the other day talking with Dr. Anduaga. In the case of liberalism in Spain is contested because at least experts, I am not an expert on liberalism in Spain, but for what I have read, it seems that liberalism, at least scholars have not been able to connect clearly or create a clear genealogy of the connection between enlightened ideas and liberalism in the peninsula. So there are some authors that seems they could be a bridge, but so far they have not encountered a consistent genealogy, at least intellectually speaking. However, and then what they defend right now is that actually liberalism in the peninsula emerged as a consequences of the war on a vacuum of power. In the case of Latin America and in the Philippines, and that Dr. Anduaga possibly also will agree with me, is that actually the liberalism enters in many different ways. However, because of the 1812 Constitution, what permeates at the end is a Spanish liberalism. And that Spanish liberalism is different with the French and the English in a sense that is articulated around Catholicism. Something that like the French and the British is in some ways no religious, no, in its conception. That will be one of the main differences. However, once the liberalism arrives in the Philippines, in the first implementation of the Constitution of 1812 in Manila and in the hinterlands of Manila, we cannot talk yet of a clear political liberalism. There is an economic liberalism that Dr. Anduaga has explored in the case of the Compania, but there is no clear political liberalism. When we see that much more ingrained liberalism in the Philippines is in 1820. And then one clear example of that is, for example, Domingo Rojas. Domingo Rojas, which actually he was involved with liberals, he was allied with members of the Real Compania de Filipinas. And then he's actually accused in the Revuelta de Tayabas of collaborating with Hermano Pule. When actually, as we were talking the other day with Dr. Anduaga, he was, how to say it, he was not guilty, but he was not innocent either, no? Because he advised Hermano Pule because he was a liberal, and I thought that Pule, as subject of the king of Spain and subject of Spain, had the right to found the cofradia. So what we see is that that liberalism maybe is not institutionalized. However, it basically, there's a set of groups and set of people that know all the time were native versus non-native. There were native, Chinese mestizos, criollos, Spaniards, that they all together keep transmitting those liberal ideas that actually Peláez, Gomburza then inherited. You know? So maybe Dr. Anduaga can elaborate a little bit the correlation between the correlation between economic liberal thought and then Filipino liberal thought. What do you think? Your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, the question is very, very interesting, and the point is, well, I can give a very partial view of this interaction because I just focus on a specific company, the Royal Company of the Philippines. But I would say that the distillation of a liberal economic thought was not synonymous with the distillation of a liberal political thought, and I would say much less with a distinctive Creole political identity. As Dr. Ruth knows, just this political identity was based on the loyalty to the king, and of course the belonging to the Spanish nation, 19th century nation. And what I found in the economic society, for example, is that this society welcomed members with seemingly contradictory political liberal thinking. On the one hand, we can find people, Creole members, such as Colonel Francisco Bayot, who, as you know, was the leader of the conspiracy of 1822, I think. But also political exiles, such as Rodriguez Valera, Domingo de Rojas again, Jose Maria Hugo, all were accused of being filibusteros in the 20s. Or the mentioned Rojas and also Azaola, Creolized Azaola, who supplied, I remember, weapons to rebels in the Tayabas revolt in the early 40s, in 1841. But on the other hand,
was not true, but it's okay.
That was not true. Good. But on the other hand,
that's another story.
There is no historical evidence about that. But on the other hand, we can find very loyal peninsulares or peninsulars, like the Economic Society's director, Manuel Bernal de Pizarro. And something similar can be stated of the Royal Company factors who became members of the Economic Society. The most prominent of all of them was José de Ortega, who was sent to prison under charges of sedition for his participation in the Novales mutiny. But at the same time, we have José Azcárraga, who was one of the father of the Azcárraga saga in the 19th century, one of those peninsular liberals who advocate for the Philippines political representation in the Parliament of Madrid. What I want to say is that the range of possibilities was wide. One could be a liberal in political affairs, but at the same time, he defended privileges in economic affairs. And I think that the privilege, the notion of privilege became the Trojan horse in the 20s and even earlier, because privilege means different things to different people. For its many detractors, it was a special, exclusive, yet clearly arbitrary and obsolete for at that time advantage enjoyed by a company with a royal concession. But by its defenders, among them some of the royal company factors, privilege was, there were necessary privileges for the nation, even if they were arbitrary. And one of the clearest exponents of this position was José Luis Munarriz, which is a very interesting individual, because he was the director of the Royal Company in the 1850s. He was a skilled writer. He made his literary career at the University of Salamanca, but he then became a trader. And he published books on trade and operations of the company. And Munarriz, for example, agreed that privileges were generally pernicious, but he said not always. In particular, the privileges of Asian companies were not, according to him. He recognized that the early charter companies abused their power with native population. He said that, even becoming tyrannical. But at the same time, he held that the commercial traffic generated by these charter companies was useful and necessary to the nations that promote it. That is, political liberalism didn't always match economic liberalism. They accepted corporative privileges, provided that these privileges were useful for a, supposed common good. That's the point.
Thank you very much to our speakers this afternoon. We'd like to read one comment from our Zoom room. On its endeavor to conquer the New World, either in the Americas or in Asia, the Spanish Empire built a powerful epistemic mechanism to collect as much knowledge as their agents could gather at different locations. And he said further, he would differentiate this from the stand of the 18th century approach of the Enlightenment, based on a scientific interpretation. However, the early modern effort achieved important advances in areas such as economics, mining, botany, geography, and pharmacy. That's from Dr. Villamar from our Zoom room. Okay. We have one last question for Ms. Felice Santa Maria before we finish this panel this afternoon. Do you think that there is a deep influence in the in the Filipino cuisine because of policies on agriculture? I mean, Spanish policies on agriculture in the Philippines during the colonial period.
I have tracked some of the colonial agricultural policies, and we do see that certain botanicals were required to be planted in home gardens or in the commons. But other than that, I think it's more of a the Spanish influence on Philippine food was not dictated at all. So that becomes the question. It seems to have been a matter of choice. And the influences for the matters of choice depended, as is always the case in acculturation, enculturation, and all of this. It's really a matter of how people interact with each other. And all the experiences of the results of the trading companies, the results of the changes in political and economic thought, what this does for the food of the natives is it allows or disallows the meeting of what you might call the colonial ruler with the colonial follower. And it is when there is more chance for the meeting to occur, especially among the mestizo class that is participant in the entrepreneurship. It is then that the culinary changes are more likely to occur. So I study the food as well as the agriculture and the trade to see at what points they intersect. So yes, there will definitely be confluences and results of the confluences. Yes. I don't know if I answered that correctly.
Thank you very much, Ms. Felice. I'd like to thank our speakers this afternoon for a very lively discussion of our panel. At this point, I'd like to call on Dr. Nikki Cruz, our main organizer for Contacts and Continuities. Nikki?
Thank you very much, Patrick. We're not just closing today's panel, we are actually closing an entire conference, part 2 of Legacies of the Encounter in Ideas and Identity Formation. I felt that today's panel was so interesting and there wasn't enough time, and I realized a week had flown by. We started part 2 last week with Barbara Watson and Daya's keynote, followed by a panel on gender, and then panels on difference and identity and the idea of Christianity, and today's final panel on emergence of Filipino Hispanic identity, whether social, economic, cultural, political, perspectives that are brewing from this side of the world that are distinctly from our consciousness and point of view. Tomorrow, we will be having, no, not tomorrow, on last Saturday, we had Panitikan at Pananampalataya, Filipino department special panel. And if you missed any of the events, I am showing on screen our website, a YouTube site, where all the recorded presentations are there, so you can always go back to see. So in behalf of the organizing committee, Jonathan Chua, Paulo Pinto, Chas Navarro, and co-conveners Noel Rodriguez, not Santa Maria, Nikki Cruz, that's me, And our technical support, Robbie Reyes and Tracy Monsod, we would like to thank the people who always run our Zoom room and YouTube live stream, headed by Chris Castillo, who's assistant to the ADSAS for Campus Events Management, and his team leaders, Vince Cosmiano, Albert Santos, and Jack de Torontegui, and their many other team members. For Facebook, the NHCP and NQC Secretariat members, Ian Alfonso, Juvelin Yerves, and Joseph Alec Yaradila, have been blasting our live stream on Facebook. Tomorrow, we start with a new conference, Part 3, Legacies of the Encounter in Institutions. The keynote speech will be delivered by Vicente Rafael, and there will be a panel immediately after, Panel 10, Negotiations of Institutions from the Middle Ages onwards. We hope you can continue joining us for all of the events to come in this Part 3 of the conference. So see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Philippine time, followed immediately at 4 p.m. by another panel. And I now turn the floor back to you, Patrick, because I know you have another event coming up in Part 3. Patrick?
The Ateneo Modern Languages Department would also like to invite all of you to Part 4 of this conference as we host Panel 16, The Legacies of the Encounter in Literature. It will be on July 16, Friday, from 7 to 9 p.m. Manila time. And this has been Contacts and Continuities, 500 years of Asian-Iberian encounters, brought to you by the School of Humanities of the Ateneo de Manila University and our partners, CHAM, Centro de Humanidades Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and the National Quincentennial Commission of the Philippines. On behalf of the organizing committee and the Modern Languages Department, this has been your moderator, Patrick KAPIL. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Muito obrigado, muchas gracias, maraming salamat.